It's good to see everyone present tonight. And we announced last night that we'll be talking about the faith of Abraham. So I invite you to open your Bibles to Genesis, the 12th chapter, and we'll begin there just briefly. John's been saying it's been a lot of years, seem like that we've known each other, and I guess that's true. I don't remember how many gospel meetings we've enjoyed together. This will just be another mark on that list. And of course, Ron, known him, since before I ever started preaching. and Tila, it's good to be with them and good to be with everybody. We've grown up. I've grown up right here in Oklahoma. I've known so many of you that are here and known of your families. And some of those are certainly gone on. We miss them. But it is good to see the faithfulness that remains and is intact and goes forward. And we pray that it always does, because we need to have faithful people living and working and engaging in this world. And we each do our own part where we are. And that's an important thing to do. Sometimes people look out and say, well, I need to do something out there. Well, we need to do something right here and right where we are. And that kind of ties us in a little bit with Abraham, because Abraham didn't just live out there. He lived in a place, a very real place, among real people, and he was living his life the way that he knew how to live it, and he was growing and developing in that life. And I hope that tonight we can really bring out that story. So most of the time when we've looked at, and probably if you think back, you probably, like me, have heard lessons called the faith of Abraham, and we're going to talk about Genesis chapter 22, because that's where Abraham's going to go offer Isaac. And that's a wonderful place to go and have a Bible study, and we'll talk about it tonight. There's not any way around it in talking about the faith of Abraham. But that's not the place that I want to start, because Abraham, as I said, was a real character. He was a real person like you and like me. God presents him to us in just that case. And Abraham had a faith at one time that was not very big as far as we see it. He's just like us. Abraham had a faith at one time that had to have a starting place. Abraham had a faith at one time that couldn't have handled chapter 22 and the offering of Isaac. He wasn't ready for that. Abraham had to develop faith piece by piece and step by step, and that is what is to be expected in our lives too. We can't just jump in and say, now I'm a Christian, and I got to have the faith of Abraham all of a sudden. That is the Isaac level of faith. Maybe you need to have the coming out of Haran level of faith. Maybe that's where we're at, because that's where he starts. And I also want to emphasize to you this evening that what we're looking at is a 25-year slice of life. We think about Abraham and say, well, Abraham lived to about 170 plus. You know, he lived a long time. But did you realize the real focus of the Bible on the life of Abraham is a 25-year slice? Now, there's a little bit maybe before and a little bit after, but primarily it's 25 years. Chapter 12 starts us with Abraham about age 75, and chapter 22, we're a little past that because Isaac is up some years, but, he's born at Abraham's 100th, so there's our 25 years, and like I say, it's a little past 25, but it's not, I used to not be able to say, 30 years ago, now I can say 40 years ago, and really, I could go past that, but I don't want to. But anyway, so you look back and you say, wow, that time is not that big of a piece of time. And I've thought about this, and I've wondered whether or not God chose this, small piece of time to help us understand that even though people were living a long time back then, you and I today can have 25 years. We've got 30 years. These kinds of things can happen in a 25, 30-year window. It did for Abraham. Now, he may have started at 75, and maybe that's not where we start. And I don't know what his life was before then. We're not really told. But we can begin there. And so I want you to think about that and think about your life of the past. How many years have you lived? Maybe you haven't lived 25 years yet. Maybe you haven't lived 30 years yet. That's well and good. You've lived your time that you have. How much of that time has been involved in where Abraham is? And maybe that'll help you as you go forward and say, you know, if I look forward to where I have reached 25 years of mature adulthood, let's say, of living like that, what's my life going to have been? How will I have spent it? How will I have used it? And can I say that somewhere along that way I've been beginning to develop the faith of Abraham? So tonight we want to look at beginning in Genesis chapter 12, and I'm going to rely again on your knowledge of the story of Abraham, because there's no way that we can read tonight chapter 12 through about chapter 24 or so. We're not going to do that, and so I want you to go home and be reading on this, and you probably need to take more than one night to do it. I would encourage that. But I'm going to give you the highlights as they come to us and as we see them. I'll give you the highlights as best that I can. And you're going to have to fill in a lot of blanks, I know, because the meat of this lesson for tonight is not really there as far as my presentation is concerned. I don't know, I spent 10 weeks, 13 weeks, I forget what it was, at home just preaching this, 1 hour at a time. So this is a lot of material, but I think we can do it in, I don't know if the time that we have remaining, but it'll be the time that remains because we'll spend it. All right, so let's begin. The faith of Abraham. Genesis 15, verse 6. Great verse to start. It's also basically quoted in Romans. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. And that is not said at the beginning of Abraham's, of the Bible story of Abraham. It's said a little bit into the Bible story of Abraham. It was after that Abraham had been able to be assessed in some fashion as to what kind of faith did he have. And so we find that he believed in the Lord at this point, and God looks at that and says he counts it to him for righteousness. So we're going to have some charts that all look very, very similar, and so the format will be easy for us to follow, and we'll see it as we build this first chart. First of all, I'm going to preempt a little bit because I can count easily at least 7 different times that I'm going to use the word visit, that God visited Abraham. It says where either God came or God spoke. And I can count 7 different instances in these texts where God has done this to Abraham. And they're all independent instances. And so we'll begin with the visit of God to Abraham. This is the first one that we're clued in on. And it is the place where his faith begins to build. And we see in chapter 12 and verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee." And then he gives him some promises. In verse 4, so Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. So we have a very simple step. God didn't give Abraham a real complex thing to do. He just said, get up and leave your father's house and go to this place I'm going to show you. Not complex at all. It wasn't some mysterious thing. It was just, this is what I want you to do. Now, Abraham has a choice. Do I believe that this is God speaking to me? And if I believe that God's speaking to me, am I going to do what he says? He's got some choices to make, and we can see the choice that Abraham makes. He immediately gets up. He says he departed. Well, it doesn't say immediately, but it says he departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And so Abram accomplishes the thing that God has set forth. That is one of the very first steps of faith. And we all go through it as little children and adults who have been teaching their little children. We all can see some of those very first developments of faith, and you just pick the subject. It may be doing a certain little thing. Here, can you hold this for me? And if they reach out and they can accomplish the holding of it for you, that's a real simple step of a child's development. And once we begin to learn language and learn obedience and learn a whole bunch of different things, and or if you tell them that here's something that you need them to do, and they may or may not believe that they're capable of it, or they may be afraid to do it or something, but because you have built up different levels of, sometimes we'd call it courage, that they are emboldened at some point to go ahead and take some of those steps. But you start somewhere. You start simple. And so God begins with Abram here in chapter 12. And it says, get up and leave where you're at. Leave your family. And then go over here to this place. Very simple. Very easy. And we see that that's exactly what Abram did. God spoke. He acted. There's nothing simpler than that. Now, on the second side of the chart, as we'll build them, we're going to see some stresses. And this is where the general context of all of these chapters really comes to its fruition, I think. Because you know what? This is life. We have some simple things of God that God has asked us to do, asked us to believe, asked us to accomplish. We see these things in the New Testament as Christians. We know that is where God's rules for churches are, and God's rules on how to become a Christian, how to live as a Christian are. And we see those things. But we also realize that life is hard. We come up against roadblocks, we come up against tragedies, we come up against things that cause us despair, we come up against things that cause us to question, we come up against circumstances in which we're tempted and maybe we do the wrong thing. And maybe we're filled with regret for having done the wrong thing. Maybe we have to correct it. We come up against all those things, and those are the things that stress the faith that we have. Now, Abraham starts with this little small faith. He's taken a very small step, which really is a big step physically, you know. He gets up and has to leave all this, what he's known, and go to a place that he hasn't known. You know, that's pretty big. But in the scope of his life, that's insignificant. He doesn't know what's going to happen in 25 years. But for him, at this moment, that's a significant step. And that is one thing that I want to try to emphasize too before we go on. It doesn't matter what stage of life that we're living. That's the stage that is significant to us at the moment. If we're at the beginning of our walk of faith, everything is just big. Everything may be, you know, kind of feel unwieldy. You know, it's huge. I've got to lift big things. Well, later on, you've been a Christian for 10 years, let's say, and you look back and say, well, that wasn't so big. At that time, though, it was the most important thing to you. It was the biggest thing that you probably maybe could conceive of. But now, 10 years later, you've got other things that are in your life. And you've grown, you've developed, you've exercised the spiritual muscles, and now you're capable of lifting more, and now the weight is also perhaps a little bit more. Now then, something you couldn't have handled back here is on your plate. And so that being said, you know, we see a pattern of growth or sometimes, unfortunately, a pattern of failure. And so we don't want to be in that pattern at all. But I do want to stress that there are these stressful things that happen that are going to come in and attack our faith in some fashion. And we see some of these things in Abraham's life. And so in chapter 12, we find one of the first stresses against his faith, and that was the deception that he has when he goes down into Egypt because there's a famine in the land of his sojourn, the land of Canaan. And so beginning in verse 10, so there was a famine in the land. Abram went down to Egypt, sojourned there, for the famine was grievous in the land. It came to pass when he was come near to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass that when the Egyptians see thee, they shall say, This is his wife. They'll kill me. They'll save thee alive. So I pray thee, I pray thee, that thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. And we have an explanation a little bit later on that shows the actual relationship, kind of a half sister there. But that was the relationship. They were husband and wife, and they also had a different relationship because of their parentage. And it's something we kind of cringe at today, but that was not so cringeworthy at one time. But this is the case of Abraham, so we don't gloss over that, just simply how it was. So he was concerned. He had a little fear of a certain situation, and because of that, he said, let's practice a little bit of deception. It's not totally wrong to say you're my sister, but I don't really want them knowing you're my wife. And so let's practice a little kind of slight deception. And that's probably maybe how he looked at it. Maybe it's spur of the moment, just whatever it was caught his attention, said, we're going to a place, they might kill me to have you. And so that would be concerning to anybody. But this was Abraham's approach, or Abram's approach at this time. And it was this. Does that match with faith? Does that walk hand in hand, this kind of deceptive process? Say, now this is the quality this is how faith works. Faith practices to deceive. Well, of course not. That's not what faith does. This is a stress against the faith that he's newly developing, at least in our case study of him. So his faith is a newly developed faith, and now he's got a stress against it. Doesn't sound like such a big thing, but to him it was. It was big at the time. And so they tell this, and of course things fall out. It doesn't work real well, and that's not the best thing that could have happened. And finally, Pharaoh understands what's going on. He gives Sarah back, and he says, "Now y'all get out. I don't want you here. This is terrible. It's been bad because of that." So they leave. We have another stress that enters into chapter 13. Abram, and by the way, before I get out of chapter 12, you notice this goes back to the simple command of God. God had spoken, said, "Abram, get up, leave Haran, and go over here and sojourn in this land." So Abram got up and he left Haran. And he sojourned that land he walked up and down in it. The famine came, he went to Egypt. What place had God promised Abram? Was it Egypt? No, God hadn't promised Abram Egypt at all. Abram seemed to be going down and perhaps thinking that I might stay here for a while. Well, he was in a place that God hadn't given him. That wasn't his place. And so Abram needs to come back to his place. And just think about that for a little bit. So he does. He comes back. Chapter 13 introduces us again to Lot. And so they had a little fuss because the herds were great and the people working with him and having trouble, so they split. Abram says, "Well, you choose and you go, take it." And so Lot says, "Well, that's the best looking place. I'll take that." Goes off towards Sodom. Abram takes what's left. And they're fine with that. But the problem is there was a family feud. And that was a stress. Troubles in a family can stress a person's faith. Abraham is no different than we are. He found that having a family, having extensive belongings and possessions, is not really the answer to all of life's problems, and it doesn't make you immune to having difficulties within your family. But there's another thing that I find as an observation. Because when we go back to chapter 12 and verse 1, God said, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy father's house." Abram had accomplished that to a degree, but he brought part of his father's house with him, and that was Lot. And I want you to notice something, that when we're talking about God's visits to Abram, God doesn't visit Abram until after Lot is out of the picture. He doesn't revisit him again. Abram hasn't completely fulfilled God's first obligation. We look at it and say, "Well, yeah, he did." Well, technically he didn't. He's not completely severed those ties, and that seems to be what God said. God's promise wasn't to Lot, Abram and Lot, it was to Abram. And so God's word had been to Abram, and he brings Lot with him. And so we find that it's not until after the division of property and peoples between him and Lot, going this way and this way, that then God reappears to him. Verse 14, "And the Lord said to Abram," after that Lot was separated from him. Now we're going to get into the next chart, but I want you to see this. He's had some stresses against his faith. And in this early stage, Abram, he accomplishes some of it, and he does some things that we would think, boy, I wouldn't have done that. Oh, that's good. I'm glad that you wouldn't have done that, but would you have at that stage of faith? Abram did. If you were not standing at your present stage of faith, would you have been just like Abram? Don't know. But it makes us think about where faith starts and how big it is when it starts. And so that's what we're considering tonight. And so when you go back and you reread these stories in depth and get the detail and the meat out of it that's there, think about these elements that build faith and these things that come against faith, and how that is so real because all of us face the same type of things. Now, you and I may not face a famine. We may not have to say, my wife is my sister, and try to do that. That may not be the thing on us. I doubt that it would. But it'll be something that be a like kind of thing. It'd be something that will stress our faith at that moment of time. So, that's the first visit. Okay, now we go. Second visit. Building our faith, the patience of God. How did it nurture Abraham's faith? I'm going to say Abraham. I know you'll understand it, but technically, until his name's changed, he's just Abram. But I always end up doing that, so overlook that if you would. And the Lord said to Abram, verse 14, chapter 13, after the Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, southward, and eastward, and westward, for all the land which thou seest. To thee will I give it, to thy seed forever, and I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. So if the man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land, and the length of it, and the breadth of it, for I will give it to thee. Then Abram removed his tent, came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar to the Lord. And what is God doing here? Well, now he's already told this to Abram one time. He told that before he came out of the land of Haran. But now he's coming back and repeating this to Abram. Because Abram needs a little strength now. I mean, he's finally gotten to the point, okay, I should have done all the things that you told me to do. Which is a good emphasis, because when we want to obey God, we've got to learn we've got to do all of God's commandments, not just some of them. We've got to complete it all. And so, if that meant that Abram and Lot needed to separate in order to fulfill that first command that God gave him, then that's what Abram needed to learn. And God gave him time to learn that. And that shows the patience of God. So he reiterates the promises. He reiterates Abram's duty. Go up and walk up and down in this land. That's what I want you to do. It was not a complicated job as far as complexity is concerned. He said, I want you to do this. And so Abram does this. He acts and he also worships. So Abraham takes this moment to go to this place, Mamre, and builds an altar there to the Lord. And so we see Abram is growing a little bit, and he's developing a little bit. Now, the stresses against his faith come to us in the next chapter. It came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these stood up, and I'm just going to say this, against 5 other kings, and they were fighting back and forth, verse 3, verse 4, and these first 4 kings, they go down to another far country, down even into the northern parts of Egypt, and they begin to fight those people, and they begin to come back up through the land of Canaan, fighting on their way, destroying things, taking captives, getting stuff. And so much so that it seems like to me that the king of Sodom, the king of some of these other places listed in verse 2, they get concerned. Here's these other kings, and if they come up through here, they're probably going to come and get us. So we need to go out, we need to go meet them on the field of battle, and maybe we can keep them from getting us. And so they meet them on the field of battle, but they lose. And so these first 4 kings, they take all they want. And they take the stuff, and they take the people. And some of those people that are included is Lot and his family. And so they take up Lot, and they start marching back off toward home. Abraham is told of this. He's got 318 trained servants in his house, and he says, let's saddle up, boys, we're going to go get them. And so they chase them all the way to Dan. So from the southern part of what we know as the land of Israel biblically up to the very northern part as we know it, and even past that up toward Damascus. And so that's when they finally catch up with them, and they have their fight, and Abram is victorious and brings everybody home. And of course, it's also at this time that he meets Melchizedek, and that is an important, unique part of the story on its own merit. But we find here is a stress, wouldn't you say? God has told Abram, now, this land is the land I'm giving you. So I want you to get up, move around in it, go up and down in it. Well, while Abram is trying to move up and down this land, here comes these warring kings. And they're creating chaos in this place, even among the place that God has said I'm going to give to Abram. Well, that'd be kind of a tough thing to do. Why would I want to walk over yonder? Because they're fighting. Maybe I should go this way. Maybe I should go this way. But these guys are fighting. They're stealing stuff. They're taking things. Well, I don't know what all Abram went through, but anytime there's war around, I think it's going to be stressful. And I think Abram's going to be stressed, saying, God's going to give me this land? And it's going to be for my generations to come that we haven't had yet. What about this faith? God said, come over here. God said, this is where I'm, and He wants me to be right here amongst all this war. Well, that may not sit well with too many people. And Abram, though, he took courage when it came down to taking his own kinsman. And he took courage and took his own household military, and they went up and they brought everybody back, like we said. So that's the trouble with kings. And so that would be a pretty good stress against faith, because God had just reiterated those promises. This land is yours. Yeah, but these people are trying to take it. Don't worry, Abram, this land is yours. Remember, God was in control of that. So let's think about that. Third visit to Abram is chapter 15. And this chapter begins with, after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision. God appeared to Abram in different ways. And then He said, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, behold, you've given me no seed. Lo, one born in my house is my heir. And so the Lord came and talked to him a little bit and said, look at the stars of the sky. Can you number them? That's how your seed's going to be. And verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and He counted it to him for righteousness. There's that verse. So we've seen that the Lord has appeared to Abram now 3 times. Each time is a position for the development and furtherance of faith. But each time after that has come things into his life that are different things that would stress that faith in God in different ways. And it comes against that faith, to conflict with that faith, to try to perhaps tear that faith down. But Abram was resilient enough in the simplicity of his faith to simply take God at His word. So when God said, get up and go, he got up and went. When He said, now Abram, since Lot's gone now, I'm going to repeat my promise, and you need to be confident in that. And Abram, okay, I'll be confident in that. Now over here, He says, I am your shield. So how does God encourage the faith of Abram? How does God confirm this? First of all, He reminds Abram who He is. Abram could just think back to these 4 kings that were fighting. God said, I'm your shield. I wonder how Abram really accomplished the victory there. I think God gave it to him. I'm your shield. I'm your protector. I'm the one who provides for you. He repeats these promises again. So we got chapter 12, we got chapter 14, now we got chapter 15. Your seed's going to be like the stars of the sky. So at least some of the promises are repeated. And then there is a covenant that begins to be entered here. And that also helps confirm Abram's confidence in God. So Abram had said, the question was in verse 3, behold, to me you've given no seed. One born in my house must be my heir. So how am I going to know about this? And so God says, look at the stars and see that. Then Abram does, and he believes. He looks at the stars and says, all right, God has said this. And God, not willing that Abram should be without complete confidence, said, all right, I am the Lord. Verse 7, I am the Lord that brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? The first question was about the generational question, about my children. Second question is about the land. And he says, well, how am I going to know that I shall inherit it? What confidence can God give Abram? When He gave him the answer about the children, God said, just look at the stars, and Abram believed that. What confidence can God give Abram about this land? So God says, He doesn't just answer it right away, does He? He says, take a heifer 3 years old, she-goat 3 years old, ram 3 years old, turtle dove, young pigeon. He took them all, and divided them in the midst, laid each piece one against the other. The birds he divided not. When the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. He got scared. And he said to Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them. They shall afflict them 400 years, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come again hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And it came to pass that when the sun went down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. So Abraham laid all these animals out, as it were a sacrifice. And God then came in the vision, and he spoke to Abram, told him these serious, dark things that would happen, that are scary, some of them. Some of them are very hopeful. And then God's sign was the smoking lamp, the burning furnace, and it passes between these pieces. And it says, in the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. So Abram, here's the sign that I'm going to give you. And the sign was the smoking and the burning lights that were there. That was the sign that God had given Abram. God chose the method. It says it was a covenant. And just because we read the word covenant doesn't mean that two people are mutually engaged necessarily in a thing. Now, Abram had engaged in the point that he had laid out the pieces of these animals there before God. But you go back to the word covenant, and the first time it's used in the Bible is with Noah. And God said, I'm going to make a covenant with man. And here it is. Here's the sign of it, and it's the rainbow. He didn't ask us if we wanted to join in that covenant with him. He didn't say, do you think it'd be a good idea? If you do X, I'll do Y. My Y is going to put the rainbow in the sky. What's your X? God didn't ask that. So when God makes a covenant, it doesn't mean necessarily that he's asking anything of another person or another party. It just means God's going to do something that it's just going to be that way because that's God's promise. And here's the sign of that promise. Well, this was what Abraham had asked for. How shall I know? Now remember, Abraham had left the land of Haran to come down here and walk up and down in it. That was the first stages of his faith. Now he's been doing that for a while. He's had these other things come against his faith and strain it in different places. And now we see through his questions that he's still perplexed a little bit. He said, well, how shall I know this and how shall I know that? And God gives them the confidence in this by these two things, the stars and then the smoking furnace and the burning lamp. And so God says, this is the answer. This is the covenant, and unto thy seed have I given this land. And so because Abraham saw that, he saw this manifestation of God, Abraham could stand in peace and confidence and comfort knowing that, well, God has spoken and I've seen what I've seen, and that's kind of the end of it. God has spoken it. So he believes that. And again, we find it interesting that right there in the middle of that chapter is where we read those famous words that he had believed and it was counted to him for righteousness. Now the stress is against faith that comes after this. You notice a pattern here? You have faith that's built and something comes against it. Next time faith is built, it's built a little stronger because he's had time to develop and something comes against it. After that, faith is built a little stronger. Something comes against it. Yeah, there's a pattern with Abraham's faith. The faith of Abraham. It's got to be tested. It's got to be challenged. And these challenges that we're seeing are a little different than some of the other challenges that we'll see. In just a minute, we'll comment on that when we get there. But here's some stress against faith. Chapter 16. Well, God said you're going to have these children. You're going to have generations come after you. Well, chapter 16, he listens to Sarah, who said, well, I'm still barren. I don't know what's going to happen, but we've tried, and we still don't have any kids. And God promised that a long time ago, back when you were 75, he said this. What are we going to do? Well, you need to take Hagar, my handmaid. That'll be from you. That's bound to be the way. We'll do it that way. I'll call the child mine. A wonderful concoction of ideas, I suppose, from a human standpoint. Sarah thought it was pretty good. I wonder how. But she thought it was pretty good. Abraham acquiesced to it. I'm not sure of his thinking on it. We're not really told, but he does what she says. And it kind of reminds me of Adam and Eve a little bit. He gets in trouble along with this, just like Adam did. But anyway, Sarah is a different case study. We're not really talking about Sarah, but you could. In fact, again, I'll encourage you pick a Bible character that has some kind of depth to it and do the same kind of study on that character. See what you observe in their life and how they develop faith. And Sarah's another one we could talk about, but we're not talking about her tonight. And so they decided to help God out in this other way. And they're going to have this child. And of course, Ishmael is born. Verse 16, Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So he's 86 years old when Ishmael was born. This was a son that was not promised. This was not the son of promise. God said, you're going to have a son. But it wasn't Ishmael. He was a son all right, but he wasn't the son of promise. And so, you know what? I don't know how much time, let's go back to 12 and 13. I don't know how much time it was exactly from when Abram was told to get up and leave and come to this land, and when he didn't fully divide away from Lot to when he finally did divide fully away from. I don't know how much time that was. But I can tell you that at the end of verse 16 to chapter 17 and verse 1, there's 13 years. We don't know what these 13 years entail. But Abram had done something that, in my view of things, set him back 13 years. That's how I would say it. Now, that's not saying, now God's over this, and He's in charge. He is fully in charge. But Abram is set back 13 years because he's 86 here, and then verse 1 of chapter 17, he was 99. We don't know what happened between, but I know what happened that led up to this. Abram and Sarah made a mistake. And that mistake, although it was a wonderful little child that was born, and Abram loved him dearly, I think there's proof of that. And I think Ishmael loved Abram. I think there's proof of that. Had respect for him. But he was not the son of promise. And so Abram's faith kind of came to a brick wall, as far as the details are revealed to us. Has your faith ever come to a brick wall? Have you ever got to a point in life and you just, things are not where I thought they might be? Maybe you can look back and see those spots in your life. Maybe you've already overcome those, but you look back and think, I really did some foolish things back there. And I can see what it caused up to this point. And the thing that changed was me changing, my repentance, my saying, I better do what God says. And then that's what changed. And those things began to change again. And this is what we see, at least in the life of Abram. So they have Ishmael. That really is a stress against faith because it's not believing what God said, because it's not the way that God had already told them. It's going to be Abram and Sarah. So now in chapter 17, God comes back to him after 13 years that we're clued in on. This is the fourth visit now. Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to him and said to him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. Had Abraham been complete? Maybe God is kind of gigging him a little bit and say, you need to be better what you've been. Okay, I'll be better. Maybe he's simply saying, walk before me and be perfect. This is the standard. Here's where I'm setting the bar at, Abraham. Hit this mark. And that would be fine too, to think of that. So walk before me and be perfect, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thee exceedingly. Well, I thought God had already made covenant. He had, but we're going to see something else that happens here. So this is faith's covenant. It's what I call faith's covenant here in the 17th chapter. And we find that God knows the weaknesses and frailties of Abram. He knows where his faith is at. He knows what he's capable of. He knows where he's messed up. And God, like a patient father, is going to encourage Abram. He's going to give him something to to be able to stand back up on and be firm on, and He's going to give him this covenant, but this time the covenant is going to be based on duty, which is a little bit more like a covenant we're used to. The first covenant, Abram didn't really do anything. He didn't have a charge to keep that God specifically said, now because I've made this burning lamp and so forth, pass between all this, you need to do this. That wasn't in that. This time it is. God said, verse 1, walk before me, be thou perfect, and I will make my covenant with thee, between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with thee. Thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee, and I'll make thee exceeding fruitful, and I'll make nations out of thee, and kings shall come out of thee, and I'll establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee in their generation for an everlasting covenant to be God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. And I'll give unto thee, and thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. I'll be their God. And God said to Abram, thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore thou and thy seed after thee in their generation. This is my covenant. What is it, Lord? This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Verse 10, every man child among you shall be circumcised. Now God gives Abraham a duty. Abraham, you're going to enter into a covenant with God. It's going to cost you something. Maybe everybody, about half the world's population, not going to appreciate what it might cost. But it's going to cost Abram something. It's going to cost the other men in his camp and his household something. Even the little boys something. It's going to cost them. But it's also going to be a significant sign that these people are bound and determined to enter into a covenant with God and to keep it. And if they don't, then later on, as God says, Moses, if it doesn't happen, he's going to be cut off from his people. But here, God says, you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. It should be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. It's a token of the covenant. He that's 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generation that's born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of thy seed, and so forth. And so God has this plan for Abram, and He says, I'm going to make this covenant, and I'm telling you already what I've told you 2 or 3 times prior to this. I'm going to make your seed numerous. I'm going to give you this land. Got these promises for you. I've already given you one sign of a covenant that's guaranteed it. But now you've been kind of set back. It's been 13 years by our way of reckoning. Been 13, and we're going to bring you back up again. We're going to strengthen you a little bit more. Remember, Abraham, I gave you these things. You believe these things. I've counted it for you for righteousness. You believe these things already. But there's things that are lacking in your life. And to strengthen the faith that you have at this point, I'm going to give you this new sign, and you're going to have to enter into this and become part of this, and physically so. And so, God says, this is for now. This is for the people with you and all the people with you now, the men. And this is also for later, your future generations. And then, of course, God has some other things to say about some other people in this text. He renames Abram. He renames Sarai. He gives them their new names, Abraham and Sarah. Tells us what they mean. And then he also tells us about this covenant that's made in the flesh. We just saw in verse 10 and following. And then he reemphasizes verse 21 that the covenant is going to be established through Sarah. Now, the problem had been in chapter 16 that they were trying to do this through Hagar. And so Ishmael was born. Verse 21, my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee. Not Hagar, not Ishmael, but Isaac and Sarah. And so God was very specific how He was going to do this. Abraham's going to have to either believe this or not believe it. Where is his faith going to be? So in this 4th visit, we begin to see, and I should say after this 4th visit, we begin to see that this kind of sets a little bit of a new tone. Remember a while ago I talked about a pattern of faith and stress and faith and stress and faith. But the stresses become a little bit fewer and farther between, and the faith becomes to be focused on a little bit more. So as Abram ages and his faith gets stronger, it seems like the stresses are not quite as either significant or they're not related to us because his faith is really getting bigger as it needs to be. So I find it interesting here that seems to be the case. So God gives them this covenant, and Abraham proves his sincerity. He proves his faith. Down in verse 22, he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abram, and Abram took Ishmael and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the self-same day, as God said to him. He didn't wait around. If there's one character trait of Abram that we could see that's been very consistent with him, at least since we've seen that language, it is he did whatever God told him to do. He did it quick. He didn't wait around. He did it as quick as he could. And so here's one of those marks. He just got up and the self-same day, this is what God said. All right, let's start. Surgery line starts here. And that's where we go. And so that happened. And that's very impressive about Abram. That tells us about his sincerity, and that tells us about the faith that he had. Now, the fifth visit of God to Abram begins here in chapter 18. And so we've seen that the Lord left Abram, that Abraham did this. In chapter 18, the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre as he sat at the tent, the door, in the heat of the day. So God comes again. This chapter really presents Abram as a friend of God. Now, there are some tests that are in this chapter for Abram. But I told you earlier that there are some unique tests that happen to Abram that are different than the other kind. This is the first one of those kind of unique tests. This is unlike the prior test, where the other tests were against Abram's faith, testing and smacking into it, going to try to tear it down. You got fear, you got concern, you got war, all these things. And an adversary is out there trying to tackle Abram and rip up his faith. This is now God's specific test, the first of its kind. And God comes, and his test is going to be, where is Abraham's heart? Shall I tell Abraham what I plan? What's God planning? Well, he's going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. Shall we tell Abraham about what's going to happen? So it says in verse 17, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham should become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth should be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abram that which he has spoken of him. Shall I tell Abraham? So God tells Abraham, Abraham, there's something to tell you about Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm going to destroy them. All right, what's the test of Abraham? That's the test of, he's got kinfolks over there. He's got maybe people he knows over there. He's known some of those people. He went and fought for some of them, brought some of them back home. Probably some of those still live at this point. Who knows? Abraham's a known commodity around those areas. Abraham, what's your heart to these people? What's Abraham begin to do? Yeah, God, just go ahead and kill them. I've heard what they're doing over there. They're terrible people. It's unthinkable what they're doing. You just need to destroy them. Oh, no. Abraham goes in supplication before God, and he says, if there's 50 righteous, will you save them? God says, I'll save them. If there's 45 righteous, will you save them? How about 30? How about 20? How about 10? Will you save them? And God said, yeah, I'll save them. What was Abraham's faith? His faith was at a level of being able to supplicate on the behalf of somebody else with the full expectation that God would give him an answer, and that God would answer that in a very positive way, that perhaps these people wouldn't have to die. They're God's creation too. They're people like he is, and he would pray for them on their behalf. If there are 50 righteous, 45, 30, 10, down to 10, would you save them? And God said that he would. What a wonderful thing Abram's done. What kind of faith does Abraham have? What kind of love does he have? He shows us the love of the God. It's the type of love that God has. Because Abraham said, if there's 10, God says, yes, I'll agree with you, Abraham. If there's 10, I'll save them. God has that kind of love. He has that kind of desire that men not perish. But they couldn't find 10. And so they were destroyed. And in that destruction, you see Abraham leaves off after 10. And I don't know, I've thought about this too a lot, because I go over there and I just count what we know and what we suspect. We count Lot and Lot's wife. We count 2 daughters that he has with him that we know of. And then it says, and daughters and sons-in-law. So that sounds plural to me. So I'll count 2 more daughters and 2 more sons-in-law, and I can't get 10 either. I don't know if that's all there was or not. But just that number, I can't get 10. But I've given at least a plural. And you can imagine Abraham thinking, there's bound to be 10. There's bound to be 10. God will save him for 10. But I'll be satisfied with whatever God's choice and decision is. And with quietness, Abraham goes ahead and accepts God's judgment, whatever it's going to be in that matter. And then pretty soon he raises up his eyes and he begins to see the smoke of the burning. And he knows that God couldn't find 10. But Abraham has to be satisfied with that, because that wasn't his call, but he trusts and believes in God. This is where the faith of Abraham, you think he could have had that faith when he came out of Haran? You think that was where it was at that time? Or did it take this series of building up and kind of getting smacked and building up and kind of getting smacked to get a faith that's strong enough to now then say, Lord, I can ask you about this, and we can talk about this, and I can supplicate for these people, because he's now developed a heart like God has. And that's important in the growing of our faith, that we also develop a heart like God has. So here's some stresses that come against it. Chapter 19 is all about the destruction of Sodom. Chapter 20, fear and assumption. It's a story very similar to the one that we saw when he went down into Egypt. This time it's with Abimelech. And, kind of a similar circumstance. He's going towards a different part of the country. And he says, you got to say you're my sister. And so they tell everybody that. Abimelech takes her. And God comes to him in a dream and says, you're but a dead man. You got somebody else's wife. Well, God, I didn't know that. He said, you better give her back. And so he comes over and grabs her back. What'd you do to me? Abraham said, verse 11, behold, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place. That's what I thought. And I was afraid. I thought you'd kill me. And so to show Abram, that he's had Sarah for a while, to show Abraham that he has not complicated her in any which way. And by the way, Isaac has not been born yet. And this is a very important part of the story, because who's to say that Isaac was not Abimelech's child? Abimelech had Sarah for however long. Who's to say Isaac's not her child? What do you do? Abimelech shows, oh no, I'm giving her back, and I'm giving the proof that I haven't touched her. Here's a bunch of livestock, here's a bunch of stuff, and you take her, here's my gifts, and we're clear. I haven't touched her. And that's good proof there. He's giving Abraham so much in that regard. And the problem is also they begin to notice it, and we know that time had taken place because the Lord closed the wombs of those women that were there in that land. How long does it take before you realize nobody's getting pregnant and nobody's giving birth here? What's going on? How long is that going to take? 9 months? Before you realize there's an epidemic of sorts? How long is it going to take? I don't know. So I presume from that, she's been there a while. So we've just got God saying, your promise over here. And this time, we didn't read that part, but this time next year, your promise is going to happen. And so that is somewhere within that period of time. I think I wanted to say one thing about that too, because you come back over here to this chapter 17. We had made the remark that between chapter 16 and chapter 17 is 13 years. But I want to also make this comment between chapter 17 and chapter 20, between chapter 21 and verse 7, that's 1 year. So God slows down the telling of this tale. In 1 year, here we got a 13-year gap. 17, this time next year, this child's going to be born. Chapter 21, the child's born. I know that's going to be a year. So all of these things happen within that period of time. And so, Sarah has been there a little while, long enough that they can know. So he's given them half-truths, and instead of being a blessing to all nations, he's been a curse to one. That's not good on Abram's part, and yet that's been a stress against his faith. Now, going to have some faith builders that happened to us in chapter 21, happened to Abraham. And we begin to see his faith is strengthened. It's just built up. Planks are put under it. And so it gets more solid as time goes. He has his troubles, but we see he's overcoming these troubles. And so the faith builders that we see are these. God's promises are coming to pass. Isaac is born on time. At the time when God had said, Isaac was born. Isaac is named. They name Isaac just like God has instructed. And so he's confident enough that the child was born with a better name than what God said. That's really a step of faith, isn't it? And he's circumcised, just like duty commanded. The 8th day, come down and circumcised the child. And then Sarah's mockery, she was back over the tent. We didn't read that part earlier, but she laughed. She says, God's going to give me a child? That laughing mockery has turned into real joy here. She says, God has made me to laugh so that all that hear will laugh with me. They're happy. She's happy. So those things have happened. And now faith in God. See, that's part of Sarah's story. Her faith in God wasn't really where it needed to be. But now her faith in God's built up too. And so they're both being strengthened because all the things God has said are coming to pass. What are the things they couldn't see? The generations to come that's going to inherit this land. The great blessings on the earth that's going to inherit this. What about those blessings and those promises that they really can't see the end of? Well, these simple elements are going to help strengthen that part of faith so they can really believe God's done this, He's going to do that. And that's where faith leads, doesn't it? So this 6th visit has these things with it, but there are some more family troubles. So time passes. Isaac is now weaned. This is from one verse to the next. And now Isaac is weaned. Abraham throws him a great feast. And here's Ishmael over here. He's pointing at him. Whatever he's doing, he's mocking him. And it doesn't sit well with Sarah. She said, you got to get rid of Hagar. You got to get rid of that troublesome child. You got to get him out of here. He can't be an heir with my son. Well, whereas before, they're the only hope we've got. And now her tune has changed. What does it say down in verse 11? This thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. I don't think it's because of what Ishmael was doing. It's because Sarah is saying, you got to take your son, because that's what Ishmael was, and throw him out. This is your son. Throw him out. That's got to hurt. Hurts any father. Throw him out. Well, that's a great concern. There's grief on behalf of Ishmael. But God strengthens Abraham's faith. So he tells him, don't worry. I'm going to take care of Ishmael. Beginning in verse 12, let it not be grievous. And I told you, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That'll be fine. But I will also of the son of the bondwoman make a nation, because he is thy seed. And so God is willing to take care of Ishmael. And he tells Abraham, don't worry so much. I'm going to deal with this. So Abraham immediately acts. He rose up early in the morning. Sound familiar? He took bread, a bottle of water, gave it to Hagar, put it on her shoulder, and the child sent him away. Didn't take him long to do it. That's tough. I'll tell you as a father, that's tough. It's hard to see your kids leave house. But under these circumstances, to be the one who sends them, effectively giving them the boot out here's the heel of my shoe. Boom, go, leave. And really you can't come back. Whew. That seems hard. But Abraham had learned, I think, his lesson with Lot. He didn't fully accomplish what God asked him to do the first time. He's going to this time. Why does he this time? Because his faith is strong enough to really trust God this time. His faith was so new in his presentation with Lot. He hadn't had these experiences. He hadn't learned to fully and 100% place all that trust in God. God said, get out from this family. Leave them all. Now, he says, I'm ready to do whatever God says, because God's going to make it right. Look what happened to us when we didn't do what God says that brought Ishmael into this world anyway. 13-year drought. As far as our Bible is concerned, Abraham and God didn't talk. Wow. That's a pretty long time. So he's ready to do whatever God says. Sixth visit to Abraham. Faith's convicted stand. That should read chapter 22 for you, but I forgot to put it up there. Excuse me. No, I'm sorry. This is still a continuation. I forgot I didn't have room on that first chart. This is still chapter 21. Faith's convicted stand comes down here to about verse 22. And again, he's having trouble with Abimelech. It's over some wells that Abraham has dug. And Abimelech's men take him by force, and Abraham gets mad at him. And anyway, so he takes him over there and says, these wells are mine, and here's what we're going to do. I've brought these 7 ewe lambs, and we're going to make a covenant, and because these wells are mine, and I've digged them. I dug those things, and you can't take them from me. And so they make that. Why why is that story in here? Someone said, well, it's because, later on we're going to have Isaac doing the same kind of thing. And so that's why the story. Why is this story here? I think it's telling us about Abraham's faith. Because Abraham had been promised this land. And you know what? Abraham's really starting to believe God strongly now. And he says, this land's mine. I have the right to dig these wells, and these wells are mine. God has given them to me. And they're for my generations to come, and I'm acting on this as a plan for my descendants after me. God said that's going to come. And I think this is an act of Abraham's faith, that he's really tied in now. He's solid, saying, this is my land. I've got generations. God's every promise is going to come true if I obey all that God has said. Now then, the seventh visit to Abraham, chapter 22. The last visit of God that we read of to Abraham is that magnificent story about Abraham, Isaac, and the offering of Isaac. That's the one we all go to talk about the faith of Abraham. But you see, we really couldn't start there. We can talk about his faith, but it doesn't tell us how he got to this point of God saying, Abraham, I want you to offer your son. Just out of the clear blue? Somebody that we don't know anything about, and all of a sudden he's got this great faith. Wow, that couldn't be me. That'd never be. I'd never been in that position. But it can be me. It can be you. Because Abraham, just like us, he starts small and that faith grows. And over 25, 30 years now, it's grown. Most of us here probably have lived that long. And I hope that we've got time left for that faith to grow the way it needs to. All of our faith needs to grow, and it can. And so God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to offer your son, your only son. So what's Abraham do? Rose up early in the morning. Same thing we read time after time. And got his animals together, got his young men together, got his son together, got the wood together, and they rode off to go out there, or walked off, however they got. And anyway, they went to that place that God said. 3 days later, he spies it. Took him 3 days to get there, and he didn't waver once. He didn't misstep. Maybe I should go back. That's weighing on my mind. What's God has asked me to do? I think I'll go back. No, he stayed with it. It was complete confidence in God, complete obedience in God. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that Abraham believed that God could raise up Isaac from the dead. So with that faith, he didn't have a problem. I'll go over there and offer Isaac like God says, and if God wants him raised up, God can do it. And God says, through Isaac, my seed shall come. So Isaac's going to live. And he had not one grain of doubt about that. Would that have been Abraham in Haran? Would that have been Abraham with Abimelech? Or Pharaoh? May not have been then, but it is Abraham now. And you see how great the challenge is now? The challenge is so much greater now for Abraham. So we find that in faith's great trial, similar to the test of chapter 18, because God does this, it's not outside force, it's not some enemy out there doing things, but it's God asking this of Abraham. So the test is a little different, and it feels different. And God's looking at this. And so he gives them a very specific command. Abraham has complete, swift obedience. And we want to remember chapter 18, verse 19, where God says, I know Abraham. I know him. Now what he's going to do, he's going to guide his family faithfully. I know Abraham. God knows Abraham. He can do this. And he's confident that Abraham will do what he said, because Abraham has passed some of these other tests. He certainly passed the other test that God gave him, dealing with Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. What does this test prove? It proves Abraham's faith and love, doesn't it? Did he believe God? Yes. Did he love God enough to do what God said? Yes, he did. To whom did it prove it to? Well, Abraham for one, and the rest of us for another. God says, I know Abraham. Abraham learned something about himself that day, and you know what? The rest of the world, we all look back to the faith of Abraham. We've all learned something about the faith of Abraham from this day, and it affirms some things of God. We sang about some of these tonight. Great is thy faithfulness. We sang about that, and God's faithful to his promises. He had made a promise in Isaac, and he's keeping that promise because Isaac's still the one that God has chosen. He's faithful in his plea for men. He's consistent in this to be as he is, because what he asked of Abraham is what he himself did. Abraham, give your son your only son. And then God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. So he's not asking of Abraham something he himself is not unwilling to do. He stayed Abraham's hand, but God himself accomplished it. Now then, it also shows God's compassion. Shows us that part of the character and the nature of God. He stopped his hand from taking the killing stroke and gave Abraham that reward and that blessing. But what is the stage of Abraham's faith? And we're going to come over to chapter 24, and then the lesson will be yours. You say, well, all of that, that's the seven times that God came to Abraham, and that's it. Well, there's one more thing, and you see it on the board. It's contagious faith. Abraham's story is not quite finished, but the times that God comes to him is finished. That's all we know about that part. Here's an instance between Abraham and his servant and looking for a wife for Isaac. And that's what they're doing in this chapter. Abraham has conviction. He says in verse 3, you shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. He's convicted about that. You're not taking a wife of these people. He's convinced. Thou shalt go to my country, to my kindred, take a wife for my son Isaac. In verse 7, and speaking of God, he shall send his angel before thee, and thou shalt take a wife unto my son from this. He's not doubting that at all. Because, his servant said, well, what if she doesn't? And he says, you're going to take a wife. There's not a question in Abraham's mind this is the way it's going to happen. He knows he's going to have descendants. It's not going to stop with Isaac. He knows that's going to happen. He's confident. He's convicted of what he shouldn't do and confident of what should happen. And so he sends a servant out there, and I've wondered if this is the same Eleazar. If it is, he's been with him about 55 years now. And if that's the case. But it says there in verse 2 that this servant was the oldest servant that he had. And so he's the guy who's closest to him. And this is the man that he trusts with this. Really, this story is more about this servant's faith than it is about Abraham. But where did he get it? If it's Eleazar, if he's been with him 55 years, if that same guy, where did he get this faith that he has? Well, he imitates Abraham. Does that sound familiar? Anything New Testament-ish kind of to you? Imitating the faith of Abraham, being a child, a son of Abraham spiritually? Well, so this servant has a faith like Abraham. Verse 12, he begins to pray. And he prays to the God of Abraham. He says, O Lord God of my master Abraham, I pray thee, send me good speed this day, and show kindness unto my master Abraham. He has prayer and confidence in the God of Abraham. His faith is accomplished. He makes his travel, and he comes and meets this girl. She does the thing he asked God about. In verse 25, she moreover said to him, we have both straw and provender and room to lodge in. And the man bowed his head and worshiped the Lord. His faith that he placed in God came to fruition. His faith is developing just like Abraham's did. And then he begins to tell everybody else a story. They get to the house, and they said, who are you? What are you? And he begins to say, I'm a servant of Abraham, and I came over to get a wife. And let me tell you what just happened. And he tells all the details, and I prayed to God, and out she came, and I gave it. Just amazing. God did all this. And he gives God the credit. He tells other people faith's story. That's what we should do as Christians, isn't it? He remembers God. Verse 52, he bows his head and worships again. And that's even prior to him leaving their place. Then finally he completes his duty because he says, don't delay me. I got to get up and go back. He's just as fast as Abraham on his obedience. Man, this guy looks a lot like Abraham, doesn't he? Just in a little bitty nutshell. But we wouldn't have appreciated that had we not known all that Abraham went through. We wouldn't have appreciated that at all. But the story doesn't finish there. I said that's the last chapter. It is the last chapter, but it's not the last chart. this is. Story continues, chapter 24 and verse 63. And Isaac hasn't seen Rebekah yet. And it says he went out to meditate. My proposal is this is the first indication. We haven't talked about Isaac very much, but this is the first indication of his faith. Isaac's going to be a man of faith too. Where did he get it? His father Abraham. He's seen that all of his life. The life that he's had with him, he's seen that. Romans chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. We'll read this, and then I want you to be thinking, what kind of faith do you have? It says of Abraham, he received the sign of circumcision, the seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe. Not just of Isaac, not just kind of sort of a spiritual father to this servant who is imitating him, but to all them that believe. He's talking about people in his generation, Paul's generation, and us today too. Though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. And the father of circumcision, those who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham. The father of all them that believe, and also them who walk in the steps of our father Abraham. That's us. How about you? Where's your faith? Does the story continue with you? It needs to. We offer you the Lord's invitation tonight to believe in Jesus Christ, that He's the Son of God, to repent of your sins and turn toward God for the salvation that He offers in Jesus Christ, and to confess that faith in Christ before men tonight. To be baptized, to be immersed in water for the remission of those sins, and to walk faithfully. We want to encourage you to do that. While together we stand and while we sing. Won't you come?